The Supreme Court's been on a roll. I mean, it's been incredible watching what they're doing. Now, the actions of the Supreme Court are really, I mean, all at once it seems, all at once, really more closely aligning the nation, the country, with more of a traditional view of the Constitution. We have a conservative SCOTUS more so, right? 6-3, they tend to be voting. And really, they are restoring a lot of the constitutional order in the United States. We saw some really big things recently. I'll get into a few of these. I mean, we've seen really religious liberty, Second Amendment. We've seen abortion get overturned. You know, in the sense that it's been sent back to the normal legislative process. Because the courts don't create laws. Congress does, and so even on its face, Roe v. Wade, where the court was trying to create a law, had issues with it, which was the grounds they overturned it on. But a bit further on this, right? Remember the Supreme Court ruling on concealed carry in New York City? I mentioned a bit of this before. Now, a lot of people were saying why that was such a big deal. You might remember some of the screaming at the sky taking place on the left, where they were saying, oh, this is going to make it so that it overturns this rule that's been in place over, I think, 100 years in New York, where if you want to get a concealed carry permit, you have to give, your justifiable reason to the government, and the government needs to learn or decide whether it's justified for you to have a gun, right? Under, again, something in the Constitution says shall not be infringed. Well, the Supreme Court determined that was unconstitutional. What New York has been doing for over 100 years was unconstitutional. And not only did they say it's unconstitutional, the biggest part of what they did was not what most of the media was talking about. The biggest part they did, the Supreme Court, was saying that gun control cases need to be reconsidered based on American text, history, and tradition. And folks, if a over 100-year-old rule, a piece of legislation over 100 years old, was not in line with American text, history, and tradition, then what would define American text, history, and tradition? Well, something over 100 years ago is what the court was saying, meaning nothing over the past 100 years at least, meaning, well, probably the Constitution. Now, the big question was, how will this be applied going forward? Because that was a pretty big decision, and really again undid a 100-year-old law in New York, and again created a new way of determining the legality of gun laws, which was the biggest point with this. It created a new standard for courts to determine, again, gun laws, and to the extent that some leftist media acknowledged accurately, in my opinion, acknowledged that determination could basically undo almost every gun law in the United States. Acknowledging, funny enough, that the Constitution gives you the right of basically having no gun laws almost. Now, the big question was, how will this look in practice? We just now saw how this looks in practice. The Supreme Court just used that part saying that a gun law has to abide by American text, history, and tradition if it's going to be passed, right? That has to be considered by the courts. The Supreme Court just heard several cases, and it sent them back to lower courts, and they told the lower courts, you reassess this based on American text, history, and tradition. Let me show you this. This is a Supreme Court ruling on this. Technically handing it back to the lower courts. The summary dispositions. Again, not technically a ruling, but in my opinion, maybe more significant than a ruling. Because what they're doing is establishing basically the way that this new law should be applied. They're making the lower courts reassess something based on these new guidelines that they created. And by forcing the lower courts to reassess things based on that, they're making the courts really put into practice the precedents of how that new system shall be applied. The new system that you and I now have as of just the past couple weeks. Now, Twitter, on the National Foundation for Gun Rights said this on Twitter, kind of explaining some of this. They said, breaking. SCOTUS overturns mag bans, right, the high-capacity magazines, if you consider over 10 rounds to be high capacity, right? It's the way they frame it. Assault weapon bans. There's no such thing as an assault weapon, but, hey, that's what they call them. And carry bans, some of the concealed carry laws, this one in Hawaii in particular. And the Supreme Court told the appellate court, go back and redo in light of what we said in Bruin, i.e., let's show you how to apply this new way of doing things that is now the way of doing things. What this means, they're saying, the Ninth Circuit upheld California's mag ban, Hawaii's carry ban. SCOTUS overturned those rulings, and the Ninth Court now has to apply text, history, and tradition to those anti-gun laws. Same thing with Maryland's assault weapon ban. The Fourth Circuit ruling upholding it has been reversed, and the lower court has to redo based on the actual text of the Second Amendment in the U.S. Constitution, which says, shall not be infringed. This spells doom for assault weapon bans. Meaning, again, folks, we are going constitutional. America, over the past couple weeks, has gone constitutional. Something many people may be surprised to understand that we have not been for over 100 years in this country. Now, there's a lot more to come from the Supreme Court. There's some big things in the process right now, and we also saw some big things just recently. Some of you may remember the interview we did with Coach Kennedy. He was the coach in Seattle who had a practice. He was a high school football coach. Excuse me. And during the football games, he'd go on the 50-yard line and he'd pray, and it was just something he did. He prayed silently, and eventually other football players, both teams actually started joining him in prayer. The school, someone in the school complained. They ended up firing him. He's, of course, suing because he wants to get back. Folks, he just won. He just won. And this was how it was being applied, basically. If you haven't watched it, check it out, by the way. This is how it was being applied. They were saying because he was a high school coach that he's an employee of the government. And as an employee of the government, he cannot have public displays of faith. Now, a lot of people talk about separation of church and state. Folks, that is not in the American Constitution. That was in the Soviet Constitution. There is nothing in the U.S. Constitution, nothing in our systems of law that says separation of church and state. That was in a letter from Thomas Jefferson to one of his friends. The only place you will find that is in the Soviet Constitution, not in the American Constitution. What it does say, what the American Constitution says, is that Congress shall enact no law restricting these rights. You can't regulate religion. Not that you can prevent people from practicing religion, which is what they essentially tried doing. This was one of the most significant cases I think we've seen also in a long time. Because, again, it was the government trying to restrict the expression of religion, saying that if you were a government employee or you're on a government property, that, again, being government property, the government has to somehow now be atheist, that you can't have any kind of public display of faith. This just undid that. And it restored the balance yet again, as I've been saying, of what the Constitution, I believe, intended. Frankly, what most of the Founding Fathers, if you read their own writings, clearly said they intended, which is the government is not supposed to restrict your rights. Not that you are restricted from exercising your rights under the government, which is a real irony how it was being applied. He just won, folks. Coach Kennedy just won. Religious freedom has, to a large extent, been restored. We're seeing about getting him back on, but if you haven't checked out that interview, be sure to check it out. It was really good. Now, next up, the Supreme Court is going to be hearing, gay rights, gay marriage, affirmative action, a few things. But really, you're seeing a lot of other things take place right now. The Supreme Court is also going to enact rules on election laws. And in my opinion, this is probably, it's hard to overstate, again, what's happening right now. Every one of these rulings is extremely significant in and of itself, let alone all at once, like we're seeing. Really, it's like Clarence Thomas just put on his American founder's hat and just decided to pull out the Constitution and just nail it to the wall of the courts or something like that. You know, I mean, not just Clarence Thomas, of course, other Supreme Court justices. It's like they just nailed the copy of the Constitution to the doors of Congress and said, "Hey, remember this thing that you're supposed to be following? Remember this thing that constitutes our government that none of you are following hardly? Well, guess what? It's back, and so you better read it."